On November 4th, 1979, an angry mob of some 300 to 500 students who called themselves Imam's disciples laid siege to the American embassy in Tehran, Iran, to capture and hold hostage 66 U.S. citizens and diplomats. Women and African Americans were released a short time later, but 51 hostages remained imprisoned for 444 days, with another individual released because of illness midway through the ordeal. How did President Carter respond to the Iranian hostage crisis? He canceled oil imports from Iran, expelled a number of Iranians from the U.S., and froze about $8 billion of Iranian assets in the U.S. At first, the Iranian government denied responsibility, but its failure to take action against the hostage takers made them look suspicious. The Carter administration could do little more at this point than to be patient and persistent. How did President Carter respond? At the same time, Carter began several diplomatic initiatives to free the hostages, but they all proved fruitless. On April 24, 1980, the U.S. attempted a rescue mission that failed. Carter was not able to gain release of the hostages during his administration, and this would hurt his image for years to come. Strategic Arms Limitations Talks. Let's take a look at the Strategic Arms Limitations Talks known as SALT I and SALT II. On January 20th, 1969, the day of Nixon's first inauguration, the Soviet government offered to hold negotiations on the issues of nuclear arms control. Nixon accepted, and the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, commonly known as SALT, were arranged. They took place in two phases. SALT I ran from 1969 to 1972 and resulted in the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and the interim agreement between the United States of America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics on certain measures with respect to the limitations of strategic offensive arms. SALT II, begun in late 1972, produced a treaty that was never ratified by the Senate. Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg Schools. Now we turn to the Supreme Court case Swan v. Charlotte Mecklenburg. Despite Brown versus Board of Education, many districts still remain predominantly white or predominantly African American due to socioeconomic reasons, because the majority of African Americans lived in low-income areas. Swan continued. Segregation was especially easy to see in North Carolina's Charlotte Mecklenburg School District, which consolidated urban city schools, primarily African American in attendance, with suburban Mecklenburg County schools, primarily white. The school board attempted to address the problem by redrawing attendance zones, but none had a significant impact on integration. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund eventually brought suit against the Charlotte Mecklenburg Board of Education on behalf of 6-year-old James Swan. In 1971, Chief Justice Warren Burger presented the opinion of a unanimous court that identified 4 problem areas with regard to student assignment: 1, racial quotas; 2, one-race schools; 3, attendance zones; and 4, transportation. Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg Schools. The solution included allowing the use of quotas, allowing a plan that grouped certain elementary, junior high, and high schools together without regard for traditional attendance zones, and providing free transportation, busing, to students to transfer to other schools in order to create a better balanced racial mix. Title IX. Title IX was the landmark legislation that bans sex discrimination in schools, whether it be in academics or athletics. Title IX states, "No person in the U.S. shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in or denied the benefits of or be subjected to discrimination under any educational program or activity receiving federal aid." Affirmative action. Affirmative action is a policy or a program that seeks to redress past discrimination, as with a person's gender or race, through active measures to ensure equal opportunity, as in education and employment. Affirmative action. Regents of the University of California versus Bach. Let's look at an example of when affirmative action affected a student in California, in the case of Regents of the University of California versus Bach. Flaws in the affirmative action policy had begun to show, even amid its good intentions. In fact, reverse discrimination became an issue. In 1978, Alan Bach, a white male, had been rejected 2 years in a row by a medical school that had accepted less qualified minority applicants. The school had a separate admissions policy for minorities and reserved 16 out of 100 places for minority students. With the Regents of the University of California versus Bach case, the Supreme Court outlawed inflexible quota systems in affirmative action programs, which in this case had unfairly discriminated against a white applicant. In the same ruling, however, the court upheld the legality of affirmative action per se. The Camp David Accords. On September 17, 1978, Israel and Egypt signed two agreements, the first between Israel and any of its Arab neighbors. The Camp David Accords were negotiated by the Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin and the Egyptian President Anwar Sadat under the mediation of Jimmy Carter at the government retreat at Camp David in Maryland. Camp David Accords. The Camp David Accords ended the state of war that existed between the two countries, and Israel agreed to withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula. Also, it provided for the establishment of normal diplomatic relations between Israel and Egypt. Stagflation in the 1970s. Stagflation was an economic condition of both continuing inflation and stagnant business activity, together with an increasing unemployment rate. In other words, prices went up, more and more people lost their jobs, and business activity went nowhere. Stagflation of the 1970s. Carter tried to combat economic weakness and unemployment by increasing government spending, and he established voluntary wage and price guidelines to control inflation, but both were unsuccessful. The most important element in the war against inflation was the Federal Reserve Board, which clamped down hard on the money supply beginning in 1979. By refusing to supply all the money an inflation-ravaged economy wanted, the Fed caused interest rates to rise. As a result, consumer spending and business borrowing slowed abruptly. The economy soon fell into a deep recession. OPEC. There was an oil crisis from November 1973 to March 1975. The OPEC, or the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, quadrupled oil prices. It was Middle Eastern countries that raised the price of oil. This, along with the increased government spending from the Vietnam War, led to severe stagflation in the United States. This oil shock, combined with the accompanying stock market crash, were considered by many to be the first events to have a persistent effect on the United States. OPEC continued. In October 1973, OPEC stopped exports to the United States and other Western nations to punish the fact that they had supported Israel. They realized the strong influence that they had on the world through oil, and the results of the oil crisis were dramatic. Prices of gasoline rose from just 25 cents to over $1 in just a few months. Up to 20% of the country's gas stations had no fuel 1 week during the crisis. Gas stations were only sold to regular customers, and in some places drivers were forced to wait in line for 2 or 3 hours to get gas. Moreover, Congress issued a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit on highways. Daylight savings time was issued year-round in an effort to reduce electrical use, and tax credits were offered to those who developed and used alternative sources of energy. OPEC continued. Also, tax credits were offered to those who developed and used alternative sources of energy, and some people switched to coal for heat. One of the long-term effects was an economic recession through the world. Inflation remained above 10%, and unemployment was at its record high. The era of economic growth, which had been in effect since World War II, had now ended. OPEC continued. The long-term effects of this situation remain even today. Many of today's appliances require less than half the energy that they required 3 decades ago. Speed limits and fuel economy stickers are a result of the government's effort to preserve oil. Exploration and development of resources within the United States increased dramatically. The government was very concerned about the dependency of the U.S. on foreign oil. The corporate average fuel economy, CAFE, eventually raised its standards up to 27 miles per gallon. Oil heat was slowly replaced by electrical heat. The sale of Japanese cars increased because they met the efficiency standards that American cars did not, and the American automobile industry was forced to meet these standards and reformulate its cars.
Lockdown.
Détente. Détente is the French word for relaxation or the easing of strained relations, especially in a political situation. Many people, when they hear this word, immediately think of the general easing of relations or the tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States in 1971, a thawing period, roughly in the middle of the Cold War. The Soviet Union and the U.S. signed a treaty, the Helsinki Accords, in which the Soviets promised to grant free elections in Europe. This was a major concession to ensure peace by the Soviets. Airline deregulation. The Airline Deregulation Act of 1978 is important because its main purpose was to remove government control over fares, routes, and market entry of new airlines from commercial aviation. The Civil Aeronautics Board's powers of regulation were to be phased out, eventually allowing passengers to be exposed to market forces in the airline industry. 3 Mile Island. Last, we look at the 3 Mile Island accident. This was a catastrophe, a partial nuclear meltdown, which occurred at the 3 Mile Island power plant, owned and operated by General Public Utilities and Metropolitan Edison in Dauphin County, Pennsylvania, on March 28, 1979. It was the worst accident in U.S. commercial nuclear power plant history and resulted in the release of small amounts of radioactive gases and radioactive iodine into the environment. 3 Mile Island continued. The accident was a significant turning point in the global development of nuclear power. Following the event, the number of reactors under construction in the U.S. declined every year from 1980 to 1998. What were the health effects? An estimated 1 or 2 additional cancer deaths in the 10-mile area around 3 Mile Island, a spike in infant mortality in the downwind communities 2 years after the accident, and a plague of death and disease among the area's wildlife, wild animals, and farm livestock. This is the end of the PowerPoint presentation of the United States in the 1970s.